Feel free to sit anywhere except the reserve seat. There's no close up this early. We're hiding out in our room.
Yeah, okay.
This is great. Yeah, I think it's like this is like first thing I pick up on. Is it? Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Yeah. Easy schedule. Yeah, absolutely.
That's not urgent. You know? It's just
tell me you eventually. If you know what, you know that.
Hi, everyone. Just a friendly reminder to silence your cell phones for the service.
Shir Lamalot Asaena Harim Maim Yavo Ezri Meim Adonai Oseh Shamayim Va'aretz. In the words of Ecclesiastes, there is a season set for everything, a time for everything, a time for every experience under the heavens, a time for dancing and a time for wailing, a time for birthing and a time for dying, a time for speaking and a time for silence, a time for seeking and a time for losing. We're here today to remember Fanny, to remember a woman who had a deep and profound impact on many lives. And as we do that, we'll share words from the Psalms, we'll share words from our tradition, and we'll share words that are explicitly and particularly about her and the life that she led. And in doing so, we weave together Fanny's life with the lives of generations that came before her, the lives of the Jewish people, the traditions of our Jewish communities, traditions that were so dear and meant a great deal to her. Brave, affectionate, small, but with large authority, a straight talker, realist, resilient, bossy, generous, smart, a person who loved Israel, classy, adaptive, radiant, talkative, a person who never took a bad picture, strong on a superhero level, deeply loving. Fanny Joseph lived a full life marked by great challenge and pain, great joy, incredible triumphs, unbelievable chutzpah, and a lot of love. More than anything else, she loved her family. She loved making big meals, using her china and crystal, being the host and serving her loved ones food. She made her own gefilte fish, and when she didn't have fish, she made it out of chicken and called it falsa fish. Violet remembers that when her family once went to visit Fanny and were staying with her in New York and they wanted to go out and get a pizza, Fanny wouldn't let them. She insisted that they did not need to go to a restaurant, that she could feed them herself. And Rebecca, you remember visiting her in college and feeling like you were strong, but still you had to hide food in your napkin because she wanted to feed you more than you could eat. So I was hearing these stories last night and it occurred to me, or 2 nights ago, and it occurred to me that Fanny knew what it meant to be hungry. She knew what it meant to not be cared for, to be a child and a teenager who had to find her own food and her own way in the world. And so for her, feeding people, making meals, filling their stomachs, which didn't always happen for her, that was her way of giving love. She didn't want her people to suffer in that way. And so she would feed her people. And it was as if she was saying in feeding them, I love you. And so filling her family with food was a very concrete way of her showing you how much she deeply loved you. Fanny loved to give enormous, fierce hugs, and she loved to grab her family's arms, and she loved to kiss all of you and show you her affection. If you were her family through marriage, if you were one of the people who worked with her at Kavod or at High Point, then you were included in her web. Fanny believed that women were the doers and the real visionaries in the world. She liked to take long walks. She liked to needlepoint, and she liked to shop in a particular way. She had a knack for buying things and then returning them, particularly clothing. And she had a particular talent for playing the stock market, including buying Facebook when she didn't even know what it was. Violet talks about how she insisted that she needed it. You don't even know what it is, but she said she had to have it. And you know what? She was right. That instinct allowed her to have the ability to be even more generous than she had been before, something that gave her great joy. While her formal education ended at age 12, Fanny could hold an intelligent conversation with anybody and at any level. She loved Israel, and she took great joy in being able to send all 3 of her grandchildren on the IST trip when they were all teens. Fanny was blessed with 2 wonderful marriages. She knew what it meant to truly be in love, and she also knew the importance of companionship. Whether her family was being easy or being difficult, because we all have our moments, right? She was loyal and she was committed. Fanny was truly a survivor. She survived the Holocaust, and that's often what we mean when we say survivor, and she certainly holds that. That describes her. But she also survived much more than that. She had the loss of her 2 husbands and of her beloved daughter, and she had her own illnesses. She continued through all of it, not only to survive, but to push herself to fully thrive. Whereas some people may have been angry, some people may have been resentful at being dealt a life that was not easy. Fanny was never angry. She poured out her emotion and her vibrancy and her attachment to the people that made her world. And whereas her world wasn't always loving and wasn't always kind, she saw the worst in people. She strived to bring love and kindness to your world. Fanny spent the last chapter of her life here in Denver, connecting and seeing so many of you regularly. She had beloved caregivers at Kavod and at High Point. And I know that some of you are here today. Thank you on behalf of this family. Your presence with Fanny meant the world. You became part of her family. And she had her son Seymour, she had Violet, she had her grandchildren, and she had her great-grandchildren who all adored her. Seymour, you visited your mom almost every day for these last years. A true testament, truly a testament of what it means to be a child, what it meant to be a son to your mother, what it meant to have kavod, honor of your mother, and also love, a commitment of love that I know that she was so blessed to have. Was shared with me that she lived to this very old age, right? And that there were probably times that she may have given up earlier, but seeing Seymour's face so regularly and seeing the rest of you who she loved, it kept her going. She was so lucky to have all of you, all of these people who loved her. And we are going to hear from so many of you today. Her primary eulogy is going to be given by her children and her grandchildren, people who knew her deeply. I also want to invite up Rabbi Steve Booth-Nadav, who's going to share a psalm with us today. Rabbi Steve is the rabbi at Kavod and knew her, and he'll also share a few words. And after we hear the psalm, we'll invite Rebecca to come forward, who will share stories from the beginning of Fanny's life.
Good morning. The Psalm of David. The Eternal is my shepherd. I shall never be in need. Amid the choicest grasses, God does set me down. God leads me by the calmest waters and restores my soul. God takes me along paths of righteousness in keeping with the honor of God's name. Even should I wander in a valley of the darkest shadows, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, God. Your power and support are there to comfort me. You set in front of me a table in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup is overflowing. Surely good and loving kindness will pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall come to dwell inside the house of the eternal for a length of days. I think I'll hold off singing it, and if it fits later, I'll do that. So Fanny lived at Kavod for many years, and when I met her, she was every day going for walks. And as they got more difficult, the walks got a little shorter than with a walker, and then around the park. And sometimes I would go for a walk with her. And one day, and I'd ask her to tell me about her life. And one day she just decided to pour it all out, her whole story, on a walk. What a gift. I remember Fanny in a crowded elevator and telling me that she remembered what it was like to be in a crowded place like that and trying to get the children to not make noise. Fanny had amazing class. She had a smile that would light up a room every single day. Most people at Kavod didn't realize she was blind. It didn't stop her. She had such amazing tenacity that she just moved, and she just made everything work for herself. She was so loving and so full of joy. I really counted her as one of my friends, and she will be missed. And I look forward to hearing your words.
My grandmother, Fanny Joseph, was born Fanny Godalovitz on February 2nd, 1924, in the small village of Bilka in what is present-day southwestern Ukraine. My grandmother's mother was named Chaya, and she gave birth to 12 children, 9 of whom survived infancy. Fanny was the 7th child born. She went to public primary school until she was 11, and then was encouraged to continue her education because she was very intelligent, but her parents could not afford to send her on to secondary school. By the time Fanny finished school, she was the oldest child at home. Her 2 older sisters, Toby and Miriam, had previously gone on to Antwerp, Belgium. So Fanny's father had also gone on to Antwerp, Belgium to stay with his daughters and to find some work. In 1936, Chaya had saved enough money to send her oldest son, David Hirsch, and my grandmother Fanny on a train to Antwerp. David was 17 and Fanny was 12. She would never see her cherished mother, Chaya, or her 5 other siblings again. Fanny and David joined their father to stay with their oldest sister, Toby, along with Toby's husband and their almost 2-year-old daughter. About a year later, Toby gave birth to another child, a son, Charles, and this whole time, Fanny helped her sister domestically. Fanny turned 14 in February of 1938, and Europe was looking very bleak for Jews. Fanny's other sister in Belgium, Miriam, was trying to save enough money to get to America, but ended up dressing in men's clothing and stowing away on a cargo ship bound for Canada. She was discovered by sailors, but instead of turning her in, they snuck her food. She did make it to Canada and then proceeded to America illegally. Still in Antwerp, Fanny found work with a well-to-do Jewish family taking care of their young daughter. The family went to Brussels to await travel documents to try and get to Portugal. And then the 4 of them left late in the spring of 1942 with forged documents that proclaimed them all to be Catholics. Fanny even wore a crucifix around her neck. In Brussels, Fanny said goodbye to her sister Toby, her niece Anna, and her nephew Charles. She carried photos of that meeting throughout the rest of her life. Fanny and her employers traveled through south to south of Bordeaux near the border of Spain. They prepared to be smuggled to Portugal via boat, but Fanny overheard someone say that sometimes the smugglers take their money, but then throw the passengers overboard en route, and she did not want to risk taking that trip. Fanny separated from the family who employed her and was on her own. She went to the Jewish quarters of the town she was in, hoping once again to find work as a nanny, maybe this time for Gentiles. But everyone was frantic and desperate, and no one paid her much attention. She sat down, not knowing what to do, but overheard some Orthodox Jewish men discussing how to catch a train to Annecy, France, which was a border town with Switzerland, and then possibly sneak into the border into Switzerland. However, this was all the way on the other side of France. Fanny would have to make the journey from west to east. Her strength, determination, and luck aligned to help her get across France with the help of strangers. On the first leg of the journey, she met a young woman, and they decided to spend a night at a hotel together, but Fanny had no papers for registration. So she hid in the bathroom while the young woman registered in her name with her papers, and then Grandma came to join her in the room. On another train, a man watched her sneak out of a train station checkpoint where they were checking tickets on the left and identification and papers on the right. Grandma, not knowing what to do with barbed wire surrounding the whole station, forged forward and gave her ticket on the left and then just kept going. A man saw her do this and said, "You are very lucky." And then he offered her further directions, claiming to be part of the French resistance. Later on a bus, an elderly gentleman asked her to sit next to him and put his arm around her. And when they were once again stopped for paper identification, he chatted with the officers, claiming to know them, and told him that Fanny was coming with him as an assistant and a helper. The agents didn't end up actually looking at his or her papers. Fanny made it across France and sneaked into the border of Switzerland, but was very quickly caught by Swiss guards. They told her that she had to go back to France, that Switzerland was not accepting any refugees. She laid down on the ground right then and there and told them she was not going back. She would rather be shot dead by them than to be taken back to the Nazis. The border agents bullied her and argued with her, but she wouldn't budge, even after spending nearly a day in a border center being ignored when she wasn't being yelled at. And eventually they gave in and ended up taking her to a refugee relocation center in Geneva. There they found her work at a ski resort where she was a domestic laborer. She had a dorm room there and a Swiss roommate named Elizabeth, who was a godsend. Elizabeth was Fanny's first Gentile friend, and they spent the next 3 years living and working together, where they got to share their hopes and dreams, as young people do. Fanny was 18 and Elizabeth was 20. They stayed in touch and remained friends for the rest of their lives. And Elizabeth's daughter, Francine, and her husband, Roger, are watching this live stream right now from Switzerland. My dad will soon come up to continue my grandmother's story, but because Grandma was the last of her family, we feel she would have wanted us to speak about the 9 other members who were murdered in Europe. Her parents and her 4 youngest siblings were taken from their home and shot in the forest in Ukraine. A brother 2 years older than her was likely conscripted and forced into slave labor, as were the other young Jewish men in the village. We don't ultimately know what finally happened to him. The next information comes from the archives of Kazan-Dawson, the Belgian Holocaust Museum, and it concerns Grandma's sister Toby and the 2 young children, Anna and Charles. Teresa Tubi Godalovich and her children, Anna and Charles, were arrested during a large anti-Jewish raid organized by the Nazis in the Jewish neighborhood in Antwerp. Tubi and her young children were taken from their beds the night of August 28th or 29th, 1942, and registered at the Dawson Barracks on August 29th as persons 541, 542, and 543. They were deported on a train September 1st and arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau September 3rd. Anna was 7 years old and Charles was 4, so it was very likely They were sent to the gas chambers immediately upon arrival. Fanny's brother, David Hirsch, with whom she had made that train trip from Bilka to Antwerp, left Belgium May 10th, 1940. Documents from France show that he was living and working in southern France in very low-paying jobs that barely covered rent and food, not quite slave labor. The Vichy government kept track of the people there, including whether they were Jewish, so that when the Nazis needed slave labor, the Jewish workers could be rounded up and sent to northern France. And this is what happened to David Hirsch. He was conscripted into slave labor and eventually transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, where he was killed. Thank you for listening and honoring this difficult chapter of Fanny's and the whole family's history. Now I will have my dad come up and he can continue her story.
After World War II, my mother returned to Bilka. When she went to her family home, she found it was occupied by gypsies who threatened to kill her if she didn't leave. My mother was fortunate that she had an uncle who survived, and still lived in Bilka. He told my mom about her family who did not survive and how they were shot in the forests. My mom met my dad in Bilka. He had been imprisoned in a slave labor camp, but he had escaped and joined the Russian army, and that's how he survived. They wound up being married in my mother's uncle's house. My mom and dad had no future in Bilka. My dad had an older brother who had survived the Holocaust by hiding with his family on the top of a factory. It was my Uncle Sam and my Aunt Johan and their daughter, was my cousin Roz. My mom and dad moved to Czechoslovakia to live with them. My mother suffered terrible anxiety and trauma from the horrors that the Holocaust had imposed on her family. The doctor told her that she needed to have a baby. And voila, in 1948, I arrived. With the Iron Curtain closing in on Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe, my father had no interest in living under Russian or communist rule. He would tell me that under communism, everybody was equal. I have shit, you have shit. He wanted to go to Israel, but my mother's only living family member, Miriam, lived in the United States. So without a question, they went to New York, me included, and we arrived in 1949. My sister Helene was born in 1950. We lived in the Bronx in New York and moved several times, each time to a better neighborhood. At first, we lived in a small apartment in the South Bronx with my Aunt Miriam's family, which soon included my cousin Sandy, who was born in 1952. When I was 8, we moved to our own apartment in Moshlu Parkway, in an apartment building that had maybe 100 families, 10 families to a floor. There was never any problem finding kids to play with in such a neighborhood. And then when I was 13, we moved to a 2-family house that we shared with my Aunt Miriam's family. My mom was very close to my Aunt Miriam. I mean, she was our only surviving family member. And unfortunately, in 1979, my Aunt Miriam passed away from stomach cancer. This hit my mother very, very hard. My mother was a tireless worker, whether she was taking care of her family, the house, or working as a clerk in a large department store. She was also a very smart woman without formal education. She had few friends and rarely engaged in social or cultural events. We didn't go to movies. We didn't eat out in restaurants. She didn't go to parties. Her life was her family, which she embraced with a tight, bear hug. There was nothing she wouldn't do for her family. She could be pushy, always believing she was doing the right thing. And most of the time she was right. Not all the time, but most of the time. My dad died in 1989 when he was hit by a car while out walking with my mother. He had just recently retired. My mom took his $50,000 life insurance proceeds and proceeded to start actively investing in the stock market. She was extremely successful and didn't hesitate to remind me that she was much more successful than I was. Her $50,000 investment grew to the extent that she was able to support herself for the rest of her life. And she was also very generous with her family and generous with Israel. Israel was part of our family. One of my dad's brothers who survived moved to Israel, and we have cousins, Mira and Judy, who live there today. My mom, in particular, supported an orphanage in Israel with donations. My sister of blessed memory, Helene, developed personality and social issues. My mother believed she was schizophrenic, and later in life, she did exhibit schizophrenic symptom type behavior. My mother was always there for her, literally and figuratively, for whatever she needed. My sister died from lung cancer in 2007. My mother remarried to Morris Gedeloff, who she met in Miami, where she was taking care of an elderly woman. Morris had also grown up in Bilka. He was in Siberia during World War II, courtesy of the Russians. And when we'd go to visit him, he'd drink hot water and offer us hot water, which he called Russian tea. My mother's approach to Morris was typical family. She told him, "You're single, I'm single, why don't we move in together?" Morris, who was in his mid to late 70s at the time, said, "Okay, but we're not going to have any children." Mom moved to Montreal, where Morris had his home. Mom never learned to drive and suffered from macular degeneration. When Morris developed dementia and was moved to a facility, she was alone. It became difficult for her to take care of herself, especially in the cold and snowy Montreal winters. We moved her to Denver to be with her family. We found her a place at the Cavote Apartments in Cherry Creek. She was an active walker and shopper, as Rabbi Steve indicated. She did entertain herself by buying things from Macy's and going back the next day to return. As time went on, she went from independent living to assisted living. After a while, we had to move her to a memory care facility, High Point at I-25 in Hamden, where she spent her last 2.5 years. My mom had difficulty swallowing solid food, so I would take her soft mashed potatoes and gravy, vanilla and strawberry yogurt, and Madeleines, which she survived on for a good 2 years. Besides memory issues and macular degeneration, Mom was hard of hearing and suffered from cognitive dissonance. She understood things but had trouble speaking what her brain wanted to say. With all that, she remained a vigorous, loving person. She loved to walk outside, albeit with a walker. She did not have much to say, but she had hugs and kisses for everyone. She was beloved by the staff who helped take care of her. She was beloved by her family that she had dedicated her life to. That was my mother.
Beautiful. Such a testament to her. We're going to now hear from her grandchildren, from Fanny's grandchildren. So David and Aaron and Rebecca will all speak.
Just like to thank you all for coming here today to pay tribute and respect to Fanny Joseph. If I had to describe my grandma Fanny with only one word, it's a word in which Rabbi Coburn mentioned earlier. It's survivor. Yes, she was a Holocaust survivor, which in its own right is a terrifying and remarkable story. But my grandma endured other tragedy and heartache. Besides fighting for survival as a young woman in Europe and losing the majority of her family, she lost her only remaining sister to cancer way too soon. And I'll never forget the pain she experienced the day we lost my grandfather, Grandpa Joe, when he was unexpectedly hit by a car one morning while they were out on one of their walks. That was one of the most painful days I can remember as a child. They say one of the hardest things you can go through in life is having to bury one of your children. And she had to do that as well when she lost my Aunt Helene to cancer at age 57. And despite all the trauma and heartache that she endured, while many others might give up and continue through life defeated, my grandma Fanny had the will to live. She was a true survivor who wanted to keep every day of her life. And I'm proud of her drive and her determination to make it to the age of 98. My grandpa Saul was a jolly, happy-go-lucky guy around us. He was always laughing, making jokes, and enjoying life. Grandma Fanny was a little different. She took life seriously. And a lot of the time, she had a no-nonsense, worried expression on her face. Growing up, my family and I thought my Grandma Jo didn't have a sense of humor due to the tragedies that she experienced. But as I got older, I spent more time around her, and I realized that just wasn't true. She could be funny. She could enjoy life. There were things that could make her smile and make her laugh, like her son, Seymour, and her nephew, Sandy Friedman, who she thought of as a son, and her grandchildren. She always made me feel like a prince. She loved being a grandparent to my brother, sister, and I, and she loved being a great grandma to my nieces, Clara and Naomi. More than anything, she valued the family she had. Family made her laugh. Family made her smile. Family kept her going for so long. Some of my greatest memories as a child were visiting my grandparents in New York City. What a treat. It was always special when Grandma and Grandpa came to visit us here in Denver. Grandma would pack goodies in her suitcase, cookies and candies to show her love. And she would pack other items from the East Coast, items which may seem a little strange to me now when I think about it. Things like an entire log of salami, kosher salami or bologna, not just a small stick of meat either. I'm talking about an entire log of salami, very thick. And she did it because she thought, this is something special that I can give to you, something you won't find in Denver. Maybe packing an entire log of salami might seem a little strange now, but at the time, I really thought it was great. My sister reminded me of a time when she flew to Denver with a crock pot of brisket on her lap, but you'll have to come over to the house for lunch to hear that story. My grandma always wanted to feed and nurture her family. It gave her a sense of pride and purpose. I remember once when visiting New York as a child, my grandpa had a variety of activities for us to do all week. Today, we're going on a boat ride around the city. My grandma would say, great, I'll pack you a lunch. The next day he would say, we're going to the Bronx Zoo. Let me pack you a lunch. The day after that, we're going to Jones Beach. Let me put some lunches together, she would say. And then there was, I've got tickets to watch the Yankees at Yankee Stadium. I'll pack you. Nope, thank you. My grandpa says, at the baseball stadium, we're going to eat hot dogs. Okay, eat hot dogs. Have a great time. Because she knew sometimes the guys just needed to be guys and have fun the way we wanted to. Grandma was a good cook and she loved to feed us. Even here in Denver, while living in her one-bedroom apartment with a tiny kitchen, she would still invite family over for her place for lunch. And I loved my grandma very much. I feel really good, and I'm at peace knowing that she was taken care of so well in her later years. I'm grateful to Rabbi Steve and everyone at Kavod. I'm grateful to the staff at High Point Facility for everything you did to make her comfortable while she stayed with you. And of course, to my parents. Mom, you did so much to help take care of Grandma throughout her years, especially since she moved to Denver. And of course, Dad, you meant the world to Grandma. She loved you more than life itself, and she cherished the love that you returned to her. You were there for her whenever she needed you. Over the past couple of years, you went to visit her almost daily to check on her well-being and to bring her food you knew she would eat just to make sure she was eating something that day. You were a wonderful son to Grandma. Thank you. Well, bye, Granny Fanny. Your courage and your grit is an inspiration to us all. We'll miss you, but I will love you forever.
I remember one day visiting my grandma while she was living in her Kavod apartment. At this point, her sight was failing her, so she would rely heavily on her audiobooks for entertainment. There was a common theme in the books she selected. They were all romance novels. I asked her that day if she ever wanted to get some variety in terms of genre of stories, maybe a mystery or a thriller. Her response was something to the effect of, Eddie, when you've gone through what I've gone through, you don't want to deal with any of that stuff. Which basically meant that she didn't need to hear about any violence or heartache because she, of course, had experienced the worst firsthand. All along, I thought she was just a sucker for the mushy love story, which is somewhat true, but I also then understood about the burden she carried with her from the trauma and the loss she experienced. When meeting with Rabbi Coburn the other night, the rabbi asked about Fanny's hobbies or interests. The family kind of looked around at each other and said that there really weren't much besides her family and feeding people. Fanny was a simple woman who did not indulge in life's luxuries, even basic ones like going to a movie or listening to music. I got to thinking why this was, and my conclusion is that Fanny relied on her senses and took pleasure in the little things. Hearing. Fanny lit up at the sound of giggles from her great grandchildren. Sight. There was no better sight than to see family, and even when she lost most of her vision, you could count on her to grab your face and bring it nearly nose to nose so she could get a good look at you. She also enjoyed the beautiful flowers she would discover on her walks, which brings me to the next sense, smell. She loved the smell of the flowers Sandy and Emily would send her for the holidays. There, of course, was no greater smell than a fresh cooked meal she prepared for loved ones. Touch. She loved to grab onto cheeks. That included the front and rear end variety. She even somehow managed to find enough tuchus on me to grab a pinchful. And taste. In her senior years, it was a piping hot matzo ball or chicken noodle soup. When she lost the ability to cook, she enjoyed the taste of my mom's delicious meals. These were examples of Fanny's hobbies and interests. The senses are something we don't think about often, and I, for one, take for granted. As I prepared these remarks, I studied up a little on exactly how the senses work, and the gist of what I got was that the brain collects information from your ears, eyes, nose, hands, and mouth, and puts it together in one big picture to help you understand the world and react to changes in your environment. Senses, of course, react to both positive and negative. I like to think that after having to experience such horrendous negative senses through the Holocaust, Fanny placed her focus on the positive ones, just as she did with the romance novels, to understand a beautiful world, and this fulfilled her heart.
What an incredible privilege to hear these stories. For those of us who didn't have the honor of knowing her, I know I don't just speak for myself. We are all incredibly moved. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your grandmother and your mother with us today. One of the stories that was shared with me when we were meeting the other night was that she knew that she passed on a love and a spirit around cooking to Violet, and that was something that the two of you shared. And I know that there's so many things that she has passed on to each one of you, and that you will keep those alive. You will keep her memory alive in everything you do, and that these stories will continue to be told for the generations that come. So I'm going to recite El Malei Rachamim in a moment. This is the prayer that is traditionally done in honor of a person who has died. I'm going to just come down and do it down here. So as I recite this, I'm really holding Fanny's soul and Fanny's memory with us, knowing that even though she has departed from this earth and she has departed from your family, that her soul continues to be, and her soul continues to resonate in the lives of each of you. Al Malei Rachamim Shochen Bamromim Ametzeh Menucha Nechona Tachat Knapei Shechina Malot Kedoshim Utorim The Zohar Arakia Masyirim את נשמת פגע בת סנדר וחיה, שלחה לעולמה, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתה. אנא הרחמים, הסתירה בסתר כנפך לעולמים, וצרור בטרח החיים את נשמתה, אדוני לנחלתה, ותנוח בשלום על משכבה, ונאמר Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure, to the soul of Pega Bat Sandar Vachaya, who has gone to her eternal home. Merciful One, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace. May her soul be bound up in the bond of life. May she rest in peace, and may her memory continue to be for a blessing. Let's get together. Amen.
That concludes our service here at Feldman. We will be headed to Mount Nebo Cemetery, and everyone's invited to come along. We don't have an escorted procession, so just please obey traffic laws, get yourself there safely. I have printed directions in the foyer if you want to grab that on your way out. At this time, I'll ask everyone to stay in your seats. I'll have the pallbearers meet me at those back doors there. Maggie and I will bring the casket around in just a moment.
You did a wonderful job.
The boss are here with you.